Hello and welcome to another video. Today I'll be taking a look at the intro music I made for my piano to orchestra series. First at the composition itself, and then perhaps in another video I'll look at the orchestration if there's some interest in that. I received a few questions about the piece, so I thought I'd make an analysis video on it. I'll start by looking at the piano piece and discussing how I wrote it. Here's the score and MIDI. I'm using the Simple Sam's signature Steinway piano here. So the whole point of writing this piece was for the introduction to my piano to orchestra series, and I wanted to show off the transformation from a simple piano piece to an orchestral one in less than 30 seconds of music. So I knew going into writing this that there would be a lot of textural and timbral shifts throughout as the orchestration moves between sections. I didn't really need to write a cohesive piece. In other words, I wasn't trying to write a melody with a great form or anything, with a beginning, middle, and end. I was really more thinking along the lines of a TV intro theme that shifts quite drastically from section to section. Having said that, I think there are some harmonic and rhythmic things that hold this piece of music together, and I'd like to talk about those things today. I'll break this down into individual ideas, either motivic, rhythmic, or harmonic. The first idea is this left-hand eighth note rhythmic triad idea. We're in the key of A, although I'm really not using a diatonic A major scale. I suppose A Lydian would be more accurate, but either way, A is the tonic. I can't remember why I picked A, to be honest. I think it was just a random choice. This left-hand idea is both rhythmic and harmonic, and the rhythmic idea is in a two-measure unit that repeats. Having the rhythm change in measure 2 is more interesting to me than staying the same. Here's what it would sound like if I just had measure 1 repeat. I think it's less exciting and maybe even too repetitive. The simple changes in beats 1 and 2 create more forward momentum and a greater sense of urgency in the music. In terms of the note choices, I chose a triad with the tonic, the second scale degree, and the fifth scale degree. So why not a major triad instead? I think there's a time and place for simple major and minor triads, but the context really matters. Because the rhythms I've chosen are rather simple and repetitive, I needed something in the harmony to create a sense of intrigue, and I think moving the major third scale degree down does this. Here's what it would sound like with an A major triad instead. I think you'll find it sounds a little too uplifting and a little bland for my taste. Moving that major third down a step creates this little bit of tension that provides a brief feeling of mystery or suspense. In those first few measures before the melody enters, we're neither in major or minor, and our ears sort of hear that unresolved tension. I sort of associate this with that classic news break music on TV, and if you think about it, I'm sort of trying to do the same thing here, that is, quickly draw in the listener, because this is going to be very brief and I need to grab their attention right away. So next is this right-hand melodic motive that starts in measure 4. The 3 quarter notes in measure 4 are sort of pickup notes to the downbeat in measure 5. Because this opening is structured in 2 measure units, I could have waited until measure 5 to start the melody, but I jump in a measure early, which again sort of helps this forward momentum idea. Here's what it might have sounded like if I had waited until the 5th measure to align more symmetrically with the 2 measure unit division. That would have also meant that the melody would start right as the left-hand harmony notes change as well, so I would probably have needed to adjust the left hand as well to fit more contrapuntally. Regardless, I think it ends up sounding a little too square. In terms of the motive itself, which I'll call the A motive, is very simple, but there are 3 things I want to point out. First, the 4th scale degree is raised by a semitone, creating that Lydian sound. I should point out that the D sharp is the major third in a B chord, and really the main tonic chord of this entire piece is an A major chord stacked against a B major chord. Just look at the last chord, for example. The piece doesn't end on a simple A major chord, it ends on this chord, which contains the notes of both A major and B major triads. So the second thing I'll point out is this grace note in measure 5. Sometimes it's the little adjustments or additions that give the music its character. And the third thing I want to point out is how I repeat the measure 5 idea in measure 6, but I shift it over by a beat. This is yet another way that I create a little bit of tension and get away from a more square or symmetrical sound. Suppose I chose to make none of those subtle adjustments, using a major scale instead of a Lydian scale, an eighth note instead of grace notes, and not shifting the idea over by a beat. Here's what that might sound like. Overall, I'd say the biggest thing is that there's less personality here. It's not clear what the intention would be stylistically. It's all a bit too safe and lacking character. So the last thing that I'll discuss in this opening 8 measures is the added contrapuntal notes in the left hand of the piano. Here I've removed the inner voice notes in the piano so we can see just the melody and left hand counterpoint. I wanted this counterline to move in the opposite direction of the right hand melody, partly because contrasting motion is always a nice option, but more importantly, it starts to expand the register outwards, both up and down. The very next measure, we will be in a much fuller register from top to bottom, so these lines help get us there. So on to the next 4 measures, things start to get a little more complicated harmonically at this point. Let's look at the left hand first. The left hand repeats the same eighth note gesture for all 4 measures. Rhythmically, it's just constant driving eighth notes, but harmonically, we now have shifted from the tonic center of A to F. That's a major third down. And just like the A chord that featured a raised 4th scale degree, this chord in F has a raised 4th as well, the B natural. With the E natural at the end of the measure, the harmony created here is an F major 7 chord with an added sharp 4. That would be the jazz approach to labeling this chord. Though my background originally is in jazz, I prefer to think of this chord as a collection of pitches from the F Lydian scale. So with the collection of notes at your disposal, it's just a question of ordering these notes from bottom to top, as well as deciding on the intervals created between notes. Instead of simply ordering them in ascending order from low to high, I create sort of a zigzag contour by first going up, then down, then up, then down, then up. Also, in terms of octave placement of these notes, notice how I group the 3rd, 4th, and 7th scale degree at the top of the bass clef staff sort of together. Well, those are the same notes as the opening left-hand material of this piece. The big difference is now that instead of an A chord, those notes are over top of an F chord. One of the things I like most about this type of triad is how well it works with a bunch of different bass notes. You could create an entire chord progression by holding these 3 notes and changing the bass note. If I were to expand this piece, perhaps I would explore this idea further. I could pretty much make any bass note work here, with maybe A sharp as the only exception. I could easily take the first 2 measures and repeat indefinitely while changing the bass notes. It's especially interesting if you alternate moving by step and by a larger interval like a 3rd, 4th, or 5th. Here's an example of this. I've just improvised a bass line using a number of different notes to give you a sense of how versatile this triad is. So looking now at the right hand of the piano in measures 9 through 12, here are those 4 measures with just the top notes of the melody. These notes make up the melodic material, while the notes that I'm not showing make up the harmonic support. The rhythms and contours in these 4 measures are somewhat similar to measures 5 and 6, and the grace note in measure 11 certainly reminds us of the earlier idea. The 2-measure idea in measure 9 and 10 is repeated and shifted down in measures 11 and 12. Unlike the previous 4 measures, there's a clear downward direction in the music. The forte dynamic at the start of measure 9 kind of naturally diminuendos throughout these 4 measures here as the line gets lower in register. And now looking at the harmony notes underneath the melody, I'll show the left hand here as well. I tend to think of this entire 4-measure phrase as having just one overarching harmony. With the left hand repeating each measure, the notes above are just sort of adding some extended harmonic color to the F sonority. All of these notes fit within the F Lydian scale. There aren't any non-chord tones present. So how did I choose the harmony notes in the right hand? Well, partly I just played around with different intervals below the melody note. I knew that the downbeat in measure 9 would be an important downbeat in the orchestration, so perhaps I went with a simple F major triad there because of that. I suppose my thinking is, well, I'll save the more unusual harmonies for less structurally important moments. Not that any of these harmonies are that unusual, but certainly a major triad is more straightforward than most chords. In beat 3 of measure 9, the right-hand F major chord moves to harmonize the B in the melody with a G major chord. Keep in mind that G major chord notes are all part of the F Lydian collection, so I'm essentially extracting different types of chords from one scale. That's why all of these notes and changing chords sound relatively consonant over the left-hand material. I could have easily kept harmonizing the top notes of the right hand with major or minor triads that fit within the F Lydian scale, but I didn't do that. Instead, in measure 10, I switched to chordal harmonies and sort of continue that until measure 12. The measure 11 beat 2 chord isn't easily labeled, but it's not that far off from chordal harmony. And the measure 12 chord is an E minor 7 chord. Again, all of these notes fit within that F Lydian scale. If I had simply chosen major and minor triads underneath the melody notes, it might have looked something like this. Instead, I think switching to chordal harmonies and some other chords here give the music more character and more personality. So I mentioned that the contour of those 4 measures was moving downward, and that takes us to the next 4 measures. Remember, we started in A, then moved down by a third to F, and now down by another third, this time a minor third to D major. And yes, the 4th scale degree is raised by a semitone yet again. The downbeat chord is that D major chord with the raised 4th, that's a G sharp. The major 3rd scale degree appears shortly after. These first 2 measures are essentially sustaining that D sonority with some passing parallel thirds ascending on the offbeats. If you include the notes of those offbeat dyads in the overall harmony during these 2 measures, the collection of notes is from an acoustic scale. That's a major scale with a raised 4th scale degree and a flattened 7th. Measures 13 and 14 are sort of a brief pause in the melody, and then in measure 15, we get the main motive again in F. So that's back up by a third. And the left hand of the piano is more prominently enforcing the note F, with a driving rhythmic figure that is quickly building in momentum towards the next measures. I decided to use a bit of deception next. Instead of the big climactic moment, there's a 3-measure subito piano section placed in a higher register. Other than the fact that it's always fun to use some misdirection, I wanted an opportunity to showcase some mallet percussion like glockenspiel or vibraphone, so I composed a brief section where they could be exposed. So I was definitely already thinking about the orchestration as I was writing this piano version. 2 other things worth mentioning here. We've sort of had a major third present throughout, and even back in the first 8 measures, the A chord had a major third in the melody. But here I use an A minor chord briefly before going to a D major chord. Just another bit of deception or misdirection I thought would add some personality to this music. The other thing worth mentioning is that the right-hand melodic material is based on the same primary motive, and in fact, it's sort of a retrograde or reverse of measures 4 through 5, especially if you're just looking at the contour. It's not an exact reversal, but close enough. I really only noticed this as I was doing this analysis. While measures 4 and 5 ascend and lead us into the piece, measures 17 and 19 descend and lead us out of the piece, or at least they lead us to the big finish. So finally, we get to that climactic moment, the last 4 measures of the piece. We return to a driving 8th note figure, this time in the right hand. It's the same pitches as the measure 1 triad, but with the addition of the 7th scale degree, the G sharp. Next, we can look at the root motion in the left hand. There's been a harmonic tendency so far to move by thirds, and these last 4 measures are no exception. We start in A, then move down by a third to F, then down again to D, then once more to B. At this point, I switch from moving by thirds to moving by fifths, in a quasi 2-5-1 cadential progression. It's not a perfect 2-5-1 in terms of the harmonic collection, but the root motion certainly is. The other thing that I'll point out is that the middle voice harmonic supporting notes above the roots are mostly stacked fifths. I just really like the sound of these quintal chords against the right-hand material. But to make it all fit, I made 2 small adjustments. First, I changed the G sharp in the right hand to G natural in measure 21 so that it didn't clash with the left-hand chord. And secondly, I could have stuck with a quintal harmony over the B chord in measure 22, but I didn't love how the C sharp sounded, so I moved it down to A. And finally, we get to the last chord, which I wanted to be much softer than the fortissimo climactic sound. As I already mentioned, this is a cluster chord built from the A major and B major chords stacked together, once again reinforcing the A Lydian collection. So that's all I want to discuss in terms of the composition itself. I'll just play the piece once more in piano. I hope this analysis video has been helpful. I should point out that everything I mentioned was me looking at this piece after the fact. I probably wrote this piece from scratch in about an hour or so, and all of these things like root motion and harmonic choices were just instinctive decisions I made during that composition session. The more you compose, the more intuitive these things become, and you find patterns in your music even if you weren't consciously making those patterns when composing. They just sort of happen when you write cohesive, organically flowing music. So I'll finish today by playing the orchestra version of this, and please let me know in the comments if you'd like me to make a follow-up video on my process for orchestrating this piece.